have with me two very exciting young people. And I say young because they are very young. And they will be actually sharing with us the results of their journey into the topic of the father of nation in art, visualizing D.S. Senanayake. I would just like to begin with an introduction to the topic and set in the context. Public image. Two words that mean a lot to politicians and celebrities. Two words that separate the politician from the populace. Two words that can elevate the son of Miriam, who was handpicked by history to be the father of the nation. If you notice, the phrase public image has the word image in it. And according to the Oxford Dictionary, one of the definitions of the word image is a representation of the external form of a person or thing in art. Can images immortalize some and incinerate others? What do images of D.S. tell us about how Sri Lanka saw him? Were cartoonists kinder to him and more critical towards other leaders of the time, especially women? These are some of the questions I wish to explore with the two brilliant panelists we have today. This talk is based on an article penned by Avishka Mario Senewiratne for the Ceylon journal, which he founded and successfully runs. Avishka is a man of many parts. He is a Sri Lankan historian, editor, aviator, and publisher. As I mentioned, he is the founder of the Ceylon journal, and his research and writing focus on political history, religious heritage, art history, and historical memory. I'm not going to go into the bios too much because that's not exactly what we are here to listen to. And then we have Ramla Wahab-Salman. He's a researcher and student of history. She has worked across over 30 state, public, private, and presidential archive collections across Sri Lanka, working across formats of audio, video, television, photography, and text. Ramla currently serves as the executive director of the American Institute for London Studies in Colombo and is a contributor to the inaugural edition of the Ceylon journal. And who am I? I'm just an advertising guy. I have a special interest in branding from a political and public perspective. I have been involved in branding projects, both commercially and for public service. And for me, there's a very interesting context to this conversation of D.S. Senanayake as a political brand. But I will not go into this, thankfully for you, but we will rely on the research of Avishka. And so, to kick off, let me ask Avishka, who is a very young, 20-something guy. What got you interested, Avishka, in this specific aspect of D.S. Senanayake? We've all heard, read about D.S. Senanayake, but why this specific aspect? And that is important because, just for context to the audience as well, this is not strictly a political discourse, so please bear that in mind. This is more an exploration of how the father of the nation is. I'm sure. Let's keep on.
Thank you, Ralston. You're more than an advertising man. Let's start off there. And am I audible at the rear end of this hall? So show of hands when I'm audible. Right, thank you. To answer your question quite briefly, earlier this year I was asked to speak about Martin Vikramasinghe, and one of my friends, I think he just entered, Udita Devapriya, wanted me to speak about something related to Martin Vikramasinghe. And I thought, since I'm working a lot on art these days, to see who are the artists or whatever who have depicted Martin Vikramasinghe. And I realized at least 6-7 people have done it. And then the question came, who is the other Sri Lankan who has had a similar amount or perhaps more sort of consideration in art history in Sri Lanka? And one of the people is D.S. Senanayake. And I realized that D.S., some people consider him to be the father of the nation. Certain presses have given him that brand. Certain people of his very own political party has given him that brand. But what were the artists of that day? And when I mean artists, people in the real sense, painters, caricaturists, and sculptors. What did they contribute in this part of the world in giving the people of that time who this man was? And bearing that in mind for future generations, because now the three of us, we never lived in the days of D.S. or his sons, Dudley or Robert Senanayake. We come from a generation coming way after. And so keeping that in mind, I was very interested to see how, because when I say D.S. Senanayake, most of you all, some sort of an image comes in your head. A bearded man, muscular, 6 feet, criticized a lot of D.S. Senanayake. Now you all know he's more than a bow-tie man. It was usually depicted in the mainstream media. So I thought these things will kind of contribute to this sort of an interesting argument on D.S. Senanayake.
Thank you, Avishka. So we hope to delve into 3 specific visual mediums in the course of this conversation. Statues, caricatures, and portraits of D.S. Senanayake, and not just limiting it to a conversation of history, but going beyond that into a study or a chat about what the visual mediums of the time were like, what are the boundaries around them, what are the sensitivities around them, and also some global context towards the end. So this is not just a conversation about the article. If you want more of that, you can read the article or Ceylon journal. Right, Ramla, before we kick off, if you could, Avishka, can always rely on pointers and details and right. Colombo, Ramla, before we kick off into this, how does Colombo as a city, as a geographical space, feature in this context? What place does it hold? Because with your sort of interest and with your research, how does Colombo figure as a city in this conversation around this type of thing?
Thank you so much, Ralston, for the generous introduction, and Avishka for the invitation to be here today. I'm delighted to be here to respond a little to Avishka's research. His extremely well thought out article that's in the 5th issue of the Ceylon journal, so buy a copy of your journal. So Colombo sort of features in many aspects. If we are to start with branding, we are at the Colombo Literary Festival, so that's the start. While just driving to the venue itself, I was just thinking, I mean, the position Colombo occupied as this ideal, idyllic, garden city, sort of the ideal as against the relatively crowded, cramped cities of India, it was very much in the political imagination to sort of draw this city out so perfectly with its avenue trees. And so even if you like just drive down Independence Avenue, you know, coming up to the statue, it's all there. It's literally an open air museum for plans of the city. It's also a part of the city Avishka and I frequent very much because we hang out a lot at the National Archives, finding all these images and such. So, and which many of you in the audience do, I mean, sort of spend a lot of time on these streets. So it's interesting to understand that. But there's also, I mean, the lovely lady who introduced us said we're going to walk through a beautiful history of the city, but I'm afraid I have to sort of color that a little. There's also the darker side. I mean, when we are talking about Colombo as place, we are sitting in what used to be an overcrowded Jawata lunatic asylum right now. So there's always a dark side to these beautiful, extremely landscaped parts of the city. But just to come to the 3 mediums you were talking about, sculpture, portraiture, and caricature, we will go through this panel and through Avishka's very interesting case study of the controversy one particular D.S. statue caused and the ruckus in the media and parliament and everything. it's really interesting, I think, to focus on the political emotions that these three mediums sort of invoke in people. So rather than thinking as from the perspective of someone viewing sculpture, rather thinking of, okay, what was the intent behind the sculpture? Was it reverence? Was it to be seen as a landmark in a city? What was it? Similarly, what was it about portraiture? We'll come to that later. And then, of course, very interestingly, caricature. Was it meant to bring a certain political leader down a peg or two in the press, or what was the reason? So, as you can see, I mean, here is a picture of horse racers outside Independence Square in 60s Colombo. And interestingly, I mean, 1971 old Parliament without as many statues as we see today. So all this really lends to the controversy Avishka is going to talk about now through his research. So over to you, Avishka.
What's Colombo without a bit of context? Right? Avishka, tell us the story behind the statue.
Now, I'm going to ask a bit of a stupid question. Has anyone seen this statue? None of you have seen it? It's right behind you all. Okay. Now, before this statue was placed here, it was placed in front of the Parliament. And when I say Parliament, the whole Parliament in the World Face. And in my article, one error was committed by me, which I will acknowledge in the next issue. By mistake, I mentioned that the sculpture behind this particular, actually I didn't mention it, but in one of the footnotes, it's considered to be Tissar's. It wasn't. And I sort of, because Tissar's style is not this clear. If you just check around, Tissar's style is totally different. I wanted to see, because one of my friends who I brought to Colombo who hasn't been out of Sri Lanka, looked at the journal and said, that man does not look like D.S. Senanayake. I mean, just look at it. It's not D.S. Senanayake. And that's the whole controversy. When this statue was first put up, in 1957, February 4th, that was our 9th year of independence. And at that time, the Prime Minister of this country was Mr. Bandara, W.R.D. Bandara. And the chief guest of that event was Chow En-lai, the Chinese premier. And the first thing when they saw this statue being unveiled, Maitripala Senanayake, not related to D.S. Senanayake, who was at that time Minister of Public Works, said, I personally feel the statue is monstrous and incongruous. The late Mr. D.S. Senanayake deserves something far better than this horrible thing. The senior minister in the cabinet of Mr. Bandaranaike. And then poor Bandaranaike got the blame of putting up this statue. And it made sense, no horrible statue of his former colleague, opponent, ridiculing as one would think of. And the Lake House, which was obviously pro-UMP at that time, before the takeover, kind of put this on the front pages, in the middle pages, kept on reminding the people that this statue, right in front of the Parliament, is not D.S. Senanayake. Right? And this was one of the first modern day statues in Sri Lanka. I mean, without considering Buddha statues or Christ statues and Dharmapada. And this was a major role of the government. And this is what the Parliament Speaker said. Simply, it's awful. She smiled. And then the Daily News and Observer, they compared photographs of the real D.S. at the statue and compared that this is nothing of the real sort. And in the meantime, the former Prime Minister, who was in the Parliament, Mr. Sir John Potala, was sort of putting the blame on Bandaranaike, right? That he should have sort of looked into this. And Dante Senanayake, who was also out of politics at the time, was quite indecisive, as this caricature by Collett depicts. But the real culprit behind this image, I really don't know. But the next slide kind of gives an indication who is looking at the clay model of the caricature while it was being constructed in London. This is Sir John Kothawala when he was Prime Minister of Sri Lanka. And right next to him is James Woodford's, the original sculpture of this statue, which is right over here right now. And the controversy continued, and there are ideas that this statue should be demolished. And then after spending quite a lot of pounds to James Woodford's, they were quite feeling, wasted, And they decided, let's put this statue in front of the parliament, in front of the whole parliament. If you go there, you will see a more realistic version of DS. So the real culprit behind this statue was probably Sir John Kothawala. But then, 70, 80 years later, we really don't care whether it looks like DS or not. Even a group of people thought it's quite cool to post in front of it, holding this journal. That's my team. I'm the person right near the statue. Next to me is this esteemed gentleman on the right. And
the old man in the middle, the old man on the side.
And while reminding this statue was unveiled by Chow En-lai, the Chinese Prime Minister, Ralston would tell who took the photograph on that day.
Yeah. Coincidentally, thanks to a Chinese tourist who happened to be running late for the bus before she headed out of the area, thankfully, very kindly helped us with the photograph. Now, Avishka, let me just sort of the controversy and how the news media saw this controversy. Did it sort of, was there a public outcry where people heard that DS was not portrait probably, or was this merely a controversy between politicians? Because nowadays you could imagine, for example, in then times, if a popular political leader is not represented properly in visual, you could imagine supporters collaborating together and protest and people being heard, people's sentiments being heard, or was this a Sri Lanka particular time?
Well, I think people are really unhappy to say this speaker who said this is awful, and Maithripala Senanayake say various things, and even Mr. Bandaranayake was clearly upset about it. I don't know how the general public reacted. There is no record, as far as my research is concerned, where people going and protesting in front of Parliament to put this down. I don't know. But it was the first of its kind, and with years getting on, people adapted to it.
As Avishka said, what the representation of a human being looks like over time is decided really by this. Talking about statues, Ramla, why are statues produced? What role do they play in our sort of perception politics, in how we perceive, and how is it sort of conceptualized from the point of the producer, the person who created it, and from those of us who sort of visually consuming what sort of emotions does it what's the context?
I wish you can pipe in as well here. I mean, it really, I suppose to a large extent also lends to the politics of the time. For, I suppose, given the character of D.S. as a subject, I mean, the number of statues of him in proportion to the city of Colombo and the country is also quite high. So there's 3, I believe, within, yeah, in Colombo at least 3.
At least 3.
Yeah. And so I suppose, like I mentioned very briefly earlier, it's also a sense of reverence that's intended, but then how the public portray and perceive it is an entirely other question. And also, I suppose, just bringing it to the contemporary times, and it's not the same understanding really. Now it would be, Ralston, you would have a very good understanding of this, the carefully curated social media campaign. What is the viral image? What is the particular object? Like, for instance, with Nehru, it was the rose and the Gandhi cap. There are particular things, and even the evolution of the moustache is really interesting in the case of our subject here today. So I suppose with time also the understanding statue definitely changes.
Avishka, if you could just take us through these three specific, among the many that Avishka has chosen, selected three, and also if you could just touch on some of the artistic influence or styles of the time, maybe that were prevalent in other cultures and countries, how is that?
Well, I mean, this was a time, say, Tisarana Singha in Sri Lanka. Most of the sculptures were forming a sort of a realism form of art, which was going in the sense of paintings as well. And as this was Ramla and I were talking about this yesterday, like certain colonial figures who are venerated in Sri Lanka, like Governor Ward in front of Dalada Malika. These statues were later moved on to elsewhere museums. One was put down in Kalutara. I think I need to check that, but that statue doesn't exist today, so I believe someone put it down. The statue of King George V. And D.S. was a good alternate, people thought, for certain colonial replacements. And when Henry Ward's statue went off, the statue that came in was D.S. Senanayake in front of the Temple of the Truth. If you go, you can see a very good view of D.S. Senanayake. On four corners of the statue there are four elephants, probably a hint of its political party. And even the Royal Academy, they considered him as an important figure. I mean, he was the same league of the founders of the Commonwealth at that time, with Nehru and Winston Churchill and so on. So they sort of thought that this sort of a person needs to be remembered, his memory must be preserved, and people should appreciate what he may have done for his time. And the third sketch, the third sculpture is one of the most interesting one, because this was the point which was believed that D.S. often saw what we have today called the Gullah actually, place he sort of surveyed the area. And this statue came up during the time of the Sedgwick regime. And the person who opened this statue was President Gopal Lala. So that speaks a lot. Sadly, I don't think whether most of these statues were sponsored by a party. I doubt it. But even if it wasn't, there were certain statues that were sponsored by private benefactors and people who were close to these.
So what this says to me from what you just mentioned actually is that D.S. Senanayake was held in high regard by his contemporaries. He's even those in the opposition, and I believe in your article you do capture some of the sentiments that even opposition politicians felt about D.S. Senanayake, and that's what sort of elevated him as a father of the nation. Can you just speak a little more?
Well, what is interesting is, like when I was investigating this man, I was trying to see the not so favorable things he did. Of course, just as any other politician, he certainly had. But what is quite amazing in comparison with another hero of the people of that time, Charles Ambrose Lawrence, who was also considered as one of the greatest men of his time. This man, who clearly had an opposition, unlike the people before independence, was even considered to be honest, down to earth, and brotherly figure to some fatherly figure. And this was necessary at that time when Sri Lanka was transitioning from a colonial state to a dominion state. And though they disagreed on policy matters, it is clear that people like Dr. N. Pereira, Dr. Colin R. De Silva, Peter Kenner were the staunch opposition at that, and they were quite a powerful opposition. They, in certain aspects, admired me, compared to people like Sir John Dudley, J.R. Jarrah.
Okay, thank you. So that sort of concludes our sort of exploration of the statues of the time and a little bit of who D.S. Senanayake was, how he was seen, but I think it's important to know that while many of us know him as the father of the nation and the the first Prime Minister of Sri Lanka, he did not just emerge during independence. What made him sort of stand out among his contemporaries, even and the political journey that he made, and what made him sort of be singled out as a part of the nation?
Well, I mean, let me ask the audience a question. How many of you have met D.S. Nobody. That's something easy for me. No, I mean, it's like this. D.S. Senanayake came from a family of substantial wealth, and he went to the leading Anglican school of his day, and he had influential friends, an influential family, and during the struggles of independence, especially during the riots in 1950, he played an active part, was imprisoned, and perhaps may have had a genuine pride for a free state from colonialism. But where things stand out is when we had elections. Whenever D.S. Senanayake contested an election, he was unopposed in state council, in legislative council. Upon the parliament, not one election did he contest. And when he came to parliament, he was a seasoned politician who had about 15, 20 years of experience as a minister in the state council, and who had a genuine track record of a person who has done something worthy in his cabinet, which was not the case for certain other people except for Mr. Kannanda. And also the fact that you must remember that D.S. Senanayake was a very shrewd politician. Though he was not educated as Sir D.B. Jatilaka or the contemporaries of his time like Mr. Bandaranaike or Dr. N.M. Pelka, Dr. Colby, he couldn't light an intellectual candle next to them, but he was one of the most great smart people of that time. And how he negotiated things between Solvery and Ivor Jennings. Ivor Jennings himself says he's one of the smartest men he has met. And that means not as a man of letters. So all these things helped him, and especially the decisive moment was when he played a major role in sort of, how do I say, kind of making way for the departing leader of the House, Sir D.B. Jatilaka. And he sort of came forward as the replacement, and thereby the people of that time considered him to be the leader in waiting. And when he won the election, democratically, he was made Prime Minister.
All right. Now we move on to another very interesting medium, portraits. Portraits play a big role in perception politics, and this continue to be. I think Ramla touched on it briefly earlier. I have seen firsthand and studied how portraits are curated by political leaders of the time, and how much effort goes into the portrayal of leaders during the time in how they want to shape how the world at the time sees them. Ramla, let's talk a little bit about portraits. What sort of emotions do portraits evoke? Are they commissioned by people? Are they for public viewing as much as statues are perhaps? Or are they intended for different purposes?
Well, on the subject is transitioning from statues to portraits. I mean, firstly, statues should also be understood with a sense of permanence, right? It's intended to be where it is forever, but we all know that that's not the case. I mean, globally, when you see there are statues that have been taken down, some, as Avishka mentioned, things moved to museums, some toppled in very violent political moments with different points of social realities and political realizations. Even in the very recent past, we've all seen the news of how that one statue of a slave owner, former slave owner, was toppled in the UK. So there's a lot of that. I mean, during de-Stalinization, a lot of statues were taken down across Russia as well. So that's really an interesting moving phenomena. But moving to portraiture, I think there's two sides of it you can think about. I mean, it can also be more intended for like a personal space, but also for public. But then again, one thing from my archival experience I've realized is the climatic conditions in this country do not give. So, I mean, in terms of preserving portraits, that's a massive question. I mean, several of us sitting in this room have also probably encountered through our work and just speaking to families about their collections. The art galleries are another question in total. But just think about the intention behind the portrait also goes to speak to branding again, right? It's very intentional. Everything is very intentional, as Avishka showed us some portraits of the man himself. It's extremely intentional, and what D.S. would have been wearing a decade from him in this safari suit here would have been very different. So it's all extremely intentional, pointed as to what your audience is to and what you were trying to sort of portray in that. Now, even when we come to the subject of women leaders, which we will talk about, Madam Indira Gandhi had a very particular way she wanted to be portrayed as firm and a sense of continuity. It wasn't really a very only feminine kind of trope or anything like that. So it's very interesting to see how this portraiture works. Yeah, Avishka, would you like to talk more about your subject?
Well, for me, what is very remarkable about portraiture of people like D.S. Senanayake is this was the age of photography. Then the question is asked, why paint them? For me personally, my view is that portraiture is a combination of art, history, and a biography. And it is not something, that is static. And the way you look at a person today with the way you look at him tomorrow, it changes. And so does the portrait. And D.S. Senanayake had commissioned, or people gratefully did it for him as a favor, quite a few portraits. And just as Martin Wickramasinghe, he had so many artists who were, because he was also involved in this struggle for independence and being called the father of the nation. And one of the first people who, as far as I have found, who painted him was A.C.J. Samarasekara. Samarasekara was called the head hunter of Sri Lanka. And the reason for it, there's an interesting quote, and I hope you can allow me to call this the leader, unless Mudli Amarasekara had painted him. He was the barometer of a man's rising popularity in fame and importance. Mudli Amarasekara, I am doing a research on him. He was doing caricatures and paintings as early as Governor Macallum. That's like 1910, 15. And he lived for 100 years, and he has done a portrait of President Premalasa. So all the leaders in between he has painted. So D.S. has to be there somewhere, right? But this painting was done in 1935, 36 rather. And this was the time where D.S. has now been established as the Minister of Agriculture, involved in Galway, involving in the North Central Province, and so many other pieces of legislature. And it is typically something that is appropriate to be hung in Parliament. Of course, this painting is in the National Art Gallery, which you cannot see for reasons best known to the Art Gallery. And this was not how D.S. was out of Colombo. D.S. was out of Colombo all the time. He was in Birigam in his electorate. He was in the North Central Province and in Galway. But this was the way he wanted to portray himself in that period, especially during campaigns. And as a person, a man of letters, which he wasn't. And ironically, after this painting, so many other world leaders who were waiting to come to similar ranks got their portraits done from Amarasekara. And as I said, they were kind of an indication of one's success. Now, this being an idealized version of D.S., we come to this painting. this portrait, which is the base of the image I've used for the Ceylon journal. Now this painting has an interesting story. Do we have time?
We do. And there is something interesting about, I think that you will notice, the audience will notice about certain way in which D.S. stands, and which has become sort of a signature of him. I wish you could touch on that long as well.
Yeah, I mean, I forgot to mention in the previous one, quite often, I can't demonstrate this here, but if you look at the videos of D.S., or the caricatures, or the painting, or this tattoo at the back, always there is one hand in one of his pockets. And this was the gesture he used to give quite often, and the artist picked it up. And usually in Parliament, or at a meeting, or a cabinet meeting, whatever, when D.S. made this gesture, people knew he was nervous. And he was going to make these lines actually as a matter of fact. And people at that time were so taken up with it, there were columns in the Daily News, in the Observer, actually as a matter of fact, just D.S.'s opinion. And when people like, now just imagine, in Parliament, he seated this side, next to him was Sir John Kothalawa, not a man of letters. Next to him, Mr. Banda, who was a man of letters. Then there are people like M.D. Banda, Mudavela, Gulampurama Disava, who people used to call sheep in sheep's clothing. And on the other side, you have N.N. Pereira, London School of Economics, Peter Taylor, Cambridge, Colombo again London University. And they are speaking with a gentleman farmer. And artists kind of captured this moment and depicted him as a man who can sort of, through his own way, negotiate politics with these people in Parliament as well as out of Parliament. And coming back to this painting, now this was done at a very critical moment when independence was being negotiated. And the key people involved in that stage were Senanayake, Sir Oliver, and Ivor Jennings, along with Solberry. This painting dates to 1946, just 2 years before independence. And Dudley Senanayake, who was also at that time involved in politics in the State Council, brings along a young artist, relatively unknown, called Stanley Abelsinghe. Stanley Abelsinghe, who was, I would say, an artist who was having one foot in the old world of Amara Sekar in realism and one foot in the modern art world of people like Daniel and so on. And he thought of forming a more, how do I say, the real sort of D.S. Like in the, what you call the drill outfit, which we often use when he was on visits, where these people on horseback. And on that particular day when he came to Woodlands, which is the official residence of, the personal residence of D.S. Senanayake in Buralla, the first question the artist asked, "Sir, please wear what you're wearing. Don't wear the bow tie. I want to portray you the way you are." And Stanley Abelsinghe, when he came up, he didn't sit for the portrait like most of the artists. He stood for the portrait and he said this was a monument of a man. And he was highly taken up with it. And D.S. of course was not so much into the painting, because this was the time he was waiting for telegrams from Oliver Golodtilaka in London, talking about what is happening about this deal of independence. So you can see the man not nervous or not so elated, but a neutral man who is having some sort of composure and restraint. And that's the image Stanley Abelsinghe portrayed of. Today this is hung at St. Thomas's College. And it has been preserved, and I think if you ever go to St. Thomas's, it's worth having a visit. But hardly, except for one book, D.S. Senanayake wrote,
Traditions of kings or someone of royalty of the time?
it certainly was. That's coming to the next page. He accepted to be a privy councillor. Privy councillor basically means an advice officer of George VI, Elizabeth II. So, and the artist for it is very interesting. Alfred Egerton Cooper, who came to Sri Lanka on D.S.'s invitation. I don't know whether D.S. was aware of art history at that time, but Egerton Cooper was one who did portraits of Sir Winston Churchill and King George VI. And Winston Churchill, as we understand, is a man difficult to please. Those who watch Crown know what he did with one of his paintings. He burned it. But the painting he did, which was done by Everton Cooper, was the painting he used for campaigns during the Second World War. The profile. And D.S. wanted a man of that nature to portray him.
Certainly, D.S. Senanayake kind of the first politician to portray himself in different to different segments of society in different times. We see this happening quite frequently. Right, now in the interest of time, we're going to move on to the third medium, and probably one that brings a little bit of comic relief, even though it's the father of the nation that we are sort of talking about. Actually, in your research, how did D.S. view caricatures? Was he a fan of them? Was he disturbed by them?
Well, I mean, I wish you asked me this question a little bit later, but to give a spoiler, the first thing he did in the morning was to read newspapers. I don't think necessarily his wife was there every sitting. Molly Guruvila, his wife. But he confessed to the Times of Ceylon that the first thing he will look in the newspaper was a caricature by Colette. And he would laugh at it if he was captured in it.
If you could just go back to the previous slide and talk a little bit about this, because even through all of the other contemporaries, how the caricature sort of not only saw him appreciate this.
Yeah, I mean, this was an interesting time because Sri Lanka has, as a matter of fact, a great tradition of caricature art from the colonial period, from the British period. People like Lawrence, people like J.F. Van Dort, Murli Amarasekar, they were the masters of caricature art. But that was a time where you will not openly say who the caricaturist was. So they use pseudonyms. Often most of these people work in government public service. So, but by the days of Colette, this painting was by Rex Van Buren in the 30s, the press was a bit more liberal, And often people would caricature artists and sign off and get away with it. This particular caricature, I don't know how clear is it for the people at the back, was, as far as my research goes, the oldest known caricature of D.S. Senanayake. And this came at a period when the leader of the house, Sir D.B. Jatilaka, had gone to London for some Buddhist conference. And D.S. was acting leader of the house. And this was a time where many people in the public were accusing the leaders of, the ministers of the State Council for not doing an efficient job, including Sir D.B. Jatilaka, who was venerated as a leader of the country. But D.S. emerged, right, and the people around him in this caricature, there's C.W.W. Kannada, there's Charles Batu Antudava, there's Peri Sundaram, there is T.V. Banabukka, and Mr. Marker Marker. But he is the leader of this particular caricature, though he is not the leader of the house. And this shows that he should have actually done this by himself. He wouldn't have had to have the courage, or he would have laid this in front. But here the artist, in my view, is showing that despite the tensions of the time, there is one man who is having the balance, the composure, to run things smoothly. And this was the turning point where D.S. was seen as the person who could run a country.
Let's move, Avishka. I think we would like to focus on two particular sort of artists of the time, Colette and another. It's interesting suddenly to see the father of the nation in the sari. What was Colette really?
It's like this. I mean, there was another interesting article I have referred in my paper, D.W. Henry. He says Colette was taking the maximum of his time, exploiting the freedom given to him by the press. It editors and the politicians of that time. What I find which is interesting is Colette ridiculed, caricatured nearly all the artists of that time, including the father of the nation. Just think for a moment, who was in Russia at that time? Stalin. Do you think Stalin would have tolerated this? Obviously not. It's something we are missing about Sri Lankan politics. But coming back to D.S., although they ridiculed him, I won't use the word ridicule as such, there was some sort of a restraint in the depictions of D.S. Senanayake. Even the facial expressions, the man is calm. There is no sign of arrogance, there is no sign of anger or tension or anxiety, but he's cool. He looks as the uncle of a nation and sometimes the father of a nation. And it's clear from all the caricatures, I have just put 5 caricatures by Colette, and I have seen hundreds, nearly all of them. He's venerated, despite being ridiculed.
How does this compare to other caricature artists of the time, cartoonists of the time? Were they as kind? Seems like a little bit more favorable, but were they critical of him? Were they kinder? What were other artists like this one?
I mean, let's take Colette for a moment. The contemporary politicians of the time, Dudley Senanayake, was often portrayed as a lazy sort of a politician. He was always, of course, they didn't make too much of fun of him, but the most unkind was Sir John Kothawala, who loved it, right? And I'll get back to Sir John Kothawala in a minute. And Mr. Bandaranaike, who was depicted as some sort of an arrogant tyrant sort of politician. Mrs. Bandaranaike, I think Ramla will explain that later, was fairly worse treated.
Yes. So it's an interesting comparison that we will come to after this. Let's move on to, since we are closing in on our scheduled time. Avishka, if you could briefly touch on the difference you see in the artistic style of D.S. I can see captions coming in here as well.
Now, in these sketches, this is an artist who was a hardcore member of the LSSP at that time. G.S. Fernando was, I would say, the earliest commercial artist in Sri Lanka. Most of the people went after him for cover images, logo designing, landscape art, and then caricatures. And when Colette left Times of Ceylon, he was the replacement for Colette. And the clear difference I see between the two of them, which is obvious, is the line he uses is much more thicker. That's the first thing. The second thing is, Colette uses the depictions to do the talking. That is, for G.S. Fernando, there is always a couple of lines. But saying that, he isn't too kind to D.S. because he had in mind that D.S. was absolutely anti-Marxist. He did not tolerate people like N.N. Pereira, Collier, and Peter Kenner. And he was one of them, G.S. Fernando. But saying that, even in portraying him, there was some sort of a reverential resemblance of his Senanayake.
Let's move, Avishka, to capture. This is very briefly. We don't have the time to go into this. This is just a few examples of other caricature artists of the time. I see a little bit of a resemblance to some asterisks style over there. Very interesting. Right. Ramla, now we will go into how caricatures were almost used as political tools, while yes, artists use them to, in your own words, bring down leaders a peg or two. Were caricatures used as political tool by the leaders themselves?
So be very short and concise here. So this is just to highlight 3 publications, right? And the different nature of different relationships of cartoons to leaders, right? I mean, Avishka brought out the example, but I suppose a fairly extreme example of like Stalin. That's like far, on the far end of the spectrum. But like here, now this particular book here is actually a publication of the J.R. Jayawardena Presidential Library itself. So that's one kind of interesting way to place a publication. Now the middle one there is about the Foreign Minister ACS Hamid. And thanks to Avishka, I was informed that that was a publication of the Foreign Ministry itself. So it's really interesting. And now the one of Nehru there is actually a quote which he made to one Shankar Pillai, who is the cartoonist of the Hindustan Times. And he basically said, "Don't spare me, Shankar." So that sort of speaks to the relationship between some cartoonists and some presidents. So it was definitely deployed as a political tool where necessary. But I mean, this is not to gloss over the case. The many cases where cartoons and caricature and sort of honing in on a particular visual symbol associated with a political leader and sort of using that to exaggerate perhaps a flaw or a political moment or something like that. We could move to the next slide. Yeah. So this is these two books are quite interesting also in the period they're published. Now, Winston Churchill is perhaps one of the most caricature political figures. I mean, his iconic cigar, the bulldog face, and many of those physical sort of features are like very well known. But it's interesting that a book on Churchill alive in cartoons came out only as recently as 2024. So while they did understand the importance of caricature and such in the press, I mean, it does take a very long time preceding for a formal sort of record of this to even be published and sort of, recorded in that sense. But on the other hand, the Ceylon in Solbury was published during the lifetime of Collect. So there's a difference there between like the timings of the publications and also speak to, I suppose, different political leaders' leanings towards caricature and cartoons. I mean, in Sri Lanka also we know that different political leaders whom we were going to have like very different relationship with cartoonists and artists. And I mean, I do understand the limitation here where we are talking only mostly about English language presses here. I do understand that limitation here. Okay, we have just a few minutes more,
Yes.
so we could go.
About the female politicians of the time portrait.
So here I perhaps won't go into the one of Madame Cinema with her glasses, but rather the other one, where that really iconic image of the weeping widow, and so she stands there remembering her late husband, whose statue was actually a gift from the Soviet Union at that period and sculpted in the Soviet style. So that this is official portraiture. But if we go to the next slide, we'll see how it kind of, the press was not as forgiving, right? I mean, we can each interpret this how we want. I really don't want to go into an analytical study of these cartoons, but it's some examples of Colette's cartoons of Madame Sirimavo of the period. Yeah. And it's interesting to place her official portraiture and caricature against her good friend Madame Indira Gandhi, because she was seen as, particularly by cartoonists, right before the Indian emergency period, as a very, very severe figure with her iconic streak of white hair that was exaggerated and sort of made to seem like this very authoritative figure. So it's interesting to see how female political leaders are also sort of portrayed through different periods. Oh yeah, this is our closing slide. Yeah. So, I mean, just to really go into this, Ralston, you can, give us your thoughts as well from a branding perspective. But just to close on this note of like iconic, either an object or a physical feature of a political leader that sort of carries through time. Like if you see Gandhi's rounded glasses, it is still sort of carried into certain high fashion brands as like an intellectual sort of look. Those rounded glasses. Then Margaret Thatcher's handbag.
Rather, if I'm not mistaken, Margaret Thatcher's handbag was the subject of a lot of cartoons and discussion around that. Can you just briefly touch on that before we close for the day? On a lighter note.
handbags to throw in all of Britain's problems. So it's as simple as that. So that was her justification to it. And in fact, if you visit the Margaret Thatcher Trust online, you will see an entire feature article about her handbag. So it's really a thing in political history. So it's really interesting to also understand the trajectory of these objects and its place in political history.
Even Margaret Thatcher's handbag might not be big enough to bring all of the British problems now. And I think on that note, we can conclude our session, our discussion rather, and open the floor for any questions to the panel. Please remember, as I said at the start, that the emphasis here has been on a sort of selected area of visual depiction, not entirely political discourse of politics of DS or of the other leaders, but rather an exploration of the visual depiction of the politics. Yes, I believe we have a question. Please state your name and ask the question.
You want me to mention my name?
Yes, please.
I'm yeah, thank you, Avishka. I just want to ask, like, it seems, like when I listen to the talk and see you, or the portraits and the statues, it seems, when you think about that era, and it's art's been elitist work, right? The work of elite. And it's not new, nothing new, right? I'm not saying that you said it's nothing new, but I'm saying, like, whatever you presented, I didn't, because it's not new to me, for instance, right? But I'm asking is, did you look at, how the single newspapers have portrayed these people? And what are there any, letters to the editors, what were people were thinking during that time? Again, my question is, what does it reveal about the society? Not Senanayake, right? About politics and all. When you visualize Senanayake, what does it say about the society? I didn't get that. If you didn't have time to say, I just want to ask you.
In the singular newspapers, Collect and G.S. Fernando were translated. But I would say G.S. Fernando was more of a singular caricaturist, and there was a translator who sort of translated his works. And these were repeated till the end of the death of D.S. And your other question was?
Did that reflect the sort of public perception?
Yeah, what
of
do
the public
you say
thought?
about revealing, visualizing Senanayake? What would you say about the society? What are the social structures? Or how the public perceive this? Right? I know different, you wrote different artists into picture and all these things. But during that era, being art, being elitist, the work of elite, it's not new. Right? But were there resistance things?
Well, I can answer this question that way.
Yeah.
Sri Lanka was a country, especially art of this form, that was to a certain audience. And newspapers at that time were brought, especially the English newspapers, by a certain type of people. And at times, people did respond to it. There were letters of editors, sometimes being unkind to the cartoonists, telling that their political view has not been sort of portrayed that way. But the masses, were they bothered with the paintings? Were they bothered with the caricatures? It's a different question. Because it wasn't for the working class. It wasn't maybe for the lower middle class, I don't know. But the people who read, who were privy to this sort of knowledge, they certainly had a good love of college. And I don't know how, in general, how people reacted to statues. As I told you when you asked the question about this particular statue. But in general, this was for a certain strata in the society.
All right. Any other questions?
I'm Ryan. You showed an image of DS in a three-piece suit at an agricultural site in Galoya. I know Sri Lanka might be cool
the three-piece suit in Galway by Amarasekar. I don't know, I mean, because this is the artist's depiction and my depiction could be totally different, what he was trying to do. But speaking about Amarasekar, he was somebody, if you look at the portraits of W. Dahanayaka, it was done in a studio, but behind him is the wall fort. And Mrs. Bandaranaika was, I think it was the ball face. So perhaps, I mean, this was a pattern for this man, Tracy G.S. Amarasekar, and I mean, it's very difficult to say what his interpretation was of putting Galway as a background. But certainly this was what they wanted to put up in Parliament, in the State Council at that time, to show this minister is behind, but is responsible for the project at the back of the page.
Yes.
Thanks a lot. I must already say that. You all have ventured into a very, very specific caricature, which art historians all around do talk about. And it's very special, and you all have done a lot of research. I'm very happy that there is some kind of discussion further than college. Now, when Mr. Bandaranaike's statue was put up at the Parliament, we noticed that the sizes were much smaller. And somebody also said, sorry to say that, no? That was said by a Sri Lanka, by a SLSP person, that there was a kind of using the statue and positioning. Mr. Bandaranaike was one of the earliest, I think, that came after the D.S. Senanayake. They were much smaller and totally devoid of any personality. So that's one of my comments. And I think we can move forward with Mr. Bandaranaike and other caricatures and just keep the caricature going, because there's a whole lot of information here. Thanks a lot, Ramla and Avishka.
Thank you.
If I could just take a minute to respond to Professor Asoka on the point of caricature. One thing we sort of didn't go into during our presentation was caricature and censorship, which is a very important subject and something, I mean, we have had several discussions about, but something to also bear in mind, both censorship from the perspective of editors, impressors, and also self-censorship, very importantly, and something I feel like as writers and members of the research community, we sort of grapple with, and even from the media industry, grapple with on a day-to-day, minute-to-minute basis, really. So that's just something really focal to think about when thinking about caricature.
Any other questions for the panel? We might have time for just one more question.
This one actually relates to censorship. Sorry, I'm Amrit. I know that a lot of artists, particularly poetry group, etc., did leave the country to a certain extent due to censorship. And I know Colette was one of them, and you mentioned Colette was replaced by another journalist, by another cartoonist during this time as well. I'm just wondering, like, was it once, when did it sort of transition?
I know the answer to your question. That's a very difficult one to answer in public. Now, you see, there was a fantastic partnership in the Lake House going at that time between one of the finest journalists of the day, Tarsi Vitachi, who used the name Fly By Night, and Colette, the cartoonist. And both were sophisticated, intelligent men who had the same goal of using satire to address a very serious issue. And one was a wordsmith, the other one was a caricaturist. It was a perfect sort of a combination in the day. And they had a very, very hard go at Mr. S.W.R.D. The column used to be called Bouquet and Brickets. The Sunday Observer. That's the thing when I go to the archives. The first thing when I see Sunday Observer, I see what has Colette and Vitachi put together. Now things came to a standstill when the 1958 riots took place. The emergency of 58, and Vitachi wrote this famous book, And there was a threat to his life. He won the Maximus Award, became a global journalist. What happened to Collett afterwards? Collett continued in Sri Lanka. And sometimes Hitachi corresponded and the column continued. But to say that, I haven't found a particular reason why Collett may have left for political reasons yet. There might be a reason. But there are other reasons which we cannot speak because of lack of verified sources. But Collett, when he went to Australia after a short while in the UK, he found work there as well. And when the press was a bit more, free and all that, surprisingly, J.R. Jayawardana's time, Collett returned to the press in Sri Lanka. There are caricatures of the somewhat modern politicians, like I saw Vincent Pereira, Dr. Anjit Tatapattu, Ananda Tissadiyavis, by Collett in the 80s and 90s.
Do we have time for more questions or are we at time? One last question. Antima last question. Yes. Just at the back and we cut out.
Yeah, I hope I'm audible. Just wanted to know, I think titles play a huge role in how people are remembered, and 75 years down the line and D.S. Senanayake is remembered as the father of the nation. Can I know, if you all know, when did the title be applied to D.S. Senanayake? Was that before independence, in the process of independence, after, or even after his demise? And where would that have come from? Would that have come from the press, maybe the people, or even political circles itself?
Interesting question.
It's a very interesting question, Asha. That's a question I'm still looking for an answer. I can't give you a yes-no answer for that, but I can tell you that there was a lot of propaganda within the party that D.S. Senanayake came from the United National Party. And there were some fine journalists of that day, like Dr. Ananda Tissadiyavis, Reggie Kandappa, who used a lot of journalism to propagate the UNP's work. And after the death of D.S., remember that D.S. died at the height of his premiership, falling off a horse. And that was some sort of a finale for a so-called hero. But I don't know really when the press started to call him the father of the nation, but this idea of different leaders being called father of a new nation, I think the States is pretty obvious, it's Washington. In India, it's shared between Gandhi and Nehru. Bangladesh has Mujibur Rahman, whose statue was put down last year. But I can tell you one thing, when the statue of D.S. was unveiled with Chow and Lai around, so Oliver Gunadhilaka, who was a very good friend of D.S., at that time was the Governor General, made a very important speech that all the English newspapers and senior newspapers repeatedly carried that message that he was the greatest Ceylonese of that time. And even the Lankadipa, which was under D.B. Dhanapala, who was somewhat of a leftist, somewhat of a supporter of Mr. Bandaranaike, carried this message in both the Times and the Lankadipa.
All right, I think we're out of time. I hope this conversation, thank you for the insightful questions, and I hope this conversation sort of sparks some interest in the role that the visual mediums, the different visual mediums play in the way public memory is shaped around public figures. And I hope we can draw some parallels from a very, very different era to an era where we ridicule and reduce the great leaders whom we produce and we vote in, with sometimes no lines being drawn. We're talking about an era where the line may have been pushed, but there's definitely a line. Whether the line was crossed and how the establishment reacts when the line is crossed is a topic of conversation. And I hope that we can sort of get inspired to study how we as individuals who are living in a different time react